now. Okay, right. So we are in Gemarah Sanhedrin. We're on page 6a, and at the end of last week, we had a situation whereby we were asking a question about the Dayanim who made a mistake, whether they had to pay damages to the litigant to whom they'd caused a loss with their mistake. And that was where we ended last week. And we said that in what situation was it that they made a mistake? They made a mistake because they didn't judge in accordance with Torah law. And the litigants had accepted upon themselves these non-expert judges only on the basis that they judged according to Torah law. And if it turned out that they'd made a mistake in the Torah law, then the litigant who lost out could then come along and claim damages from the judge. And we spoke about that last week. And now the Gemarah is going to go into it in a little bit more detail. Let me put the Gemarah on the screen. Okay, I'm hoping that you can see the Gemarah now. Can you see the Gemarah? Yeah. Okay. So this is where we got to last time. The Amrulay, they can say, the litigants can say, Dayant lan din Torah. You need to, we wanted you to judge us according to the halacha, and you didn't do it, and therefore you made a mistake, and therefore we have a claim against you. So now we're going to ask a bit of a deeper question. Amalei Rav Safra le Rabbi Abba. So Rav Safra says to Rabbi Abba, the ta'a b'mai. Ta'a, they made a mistake. B'mai, same word as ma. In what way did they make a mistake? What was the error that they made? Ilema, if you will say, the ta'a, that they made a mistake, bidvar mishnah, that they made a mistake with something which is a clear ruling in the Mishnah. V'ha'amar Rav Sheshet, have we not got a statement of Rav Sheshet, Amar, who said, in the Rabbi Ami, who said in the name of Rabbi Ami, Ta'a bidvar Mishnah, somebody who makes a mistake in a halacha which is clearly set out in the Mishnah, choser, he is allowed to retract. In other words, you can rule that this was an incorrect verdict, you can retract the verdict and start again. And therefore, there's no mistake, because before any money is handed over from one to another, you retract the verdict, and you then either have a retrial or you then give the correct verdict. This is a situation when we're dealing with something which is called a Dvar Mishnah. A Dvar Mishnah is a situation where the halacha is undisputed in the Mishnah. So let's take an example. Yes,
Johnny, excuse me. We're talking about only one judge here. There was only one judge judging.
Okay. Hold the question, because the Gemarah asks the question in a slightly different way later on.
Okay.
The simple answer to your question is yes, because if we've got a court of three, they're not going to make a mistake in the Dvar Mishnah. That's the bottom line of the Gemarah.
Yeah.
So here we have a Dvar Mishnah is a very simple, clear halacha that everybody accepts. Let's give a sort of very simple example. Remember, we're talking about monetary cases here. So we have a situation whereby Reuven lends 100 shekels to Shimon. And he has a document which is witnessed, and it comes along with this document that's witnessed, and it says, on such and such a date, Reuven lent 100 shekels to Shimon. And this has to be paid back by the 1st of Tishrei. By Rosh Hashanah, it has to be paid back. Shimon comes along with this document, and he says, Reuven comes along with this document to Shimon, and he says, you need to pay me back the 100 shekels that I lent you. And Shimon says, I didn't borrow anything from you. So Reuven says, well, I've got this document. It's signed by you. It's witnessed by 2 people. Here it is. This document says that I lent you money and you have to pay me back, and you haven't paid it back. So they go to court, and the halacha is very clear in the Mishnah that unless there is any reason that Shimon can say that this is a forgery, that document means that Reuven is entitled to his money back. And there is no dispute about that, because there is a document which is signed with 2 witnesses. Now, if they go to court and they have 1 judge or even 2 judges, and they go along, and Shimon says, I'm not paying up. It's not a forgery. I agree it's not a forgery, but I'm not paying up. I don't owe you the money. And they go to court, and the judge, with no evidence that's a forgery, says, the halacha is that Shimon doesn't have to pay. And this is clearly wrong. There's no opinion in the Mishnah that says that. That is called Ta'ah Bidvar Mishnah. Remember, we're talking here about non-expert judges in our situation. They may well have agreed, these 2 people, to go to court. Reuven and Shimon will have agreed to go to court, but Reuven will have said, I want you to paskin according to halacha, like we said at the end of last week. And he comes along and he gives the wrong verdict. And everybody knows it's the wrong verdict, because there's no opinion in the Mishnah, or in our day, there's no opinion in the Shulchan Aruch that says that's the case. In that case, he can retract his verdict. Somebody comes along and says, can I just point out to you that the psak that you've just given is completely wrong. There is nobody in the Mishnah that holds like that. And he says, really, is that the case? And yes, that's the case. And he goes and looks it up, and he realizes, oy vey, I've made a terrible mistake. He is allowed to retract. So in that case, once he's retracted, they will make the correct verdict, and there will be no loss to any litigant, and therefore he's not got any liability. Okay, so the question of Rav Safra to Rabbi Abba was, it can't be that case. What's the case we're talking about where he made a mistake? It can't be where he made such a blatant error. It reminds me of Lahavdil, reminds me of the VAR in football, or the DRS in cricket. It's got to be a clear and obvious error before they will override it. So this here is a clear and obvious error. VAR is going to come along and override and overrule his decision, this judge, because it's a clear and obvious error. So that's not what we're talking about, because in a clear and obvious error, he's allowed to be choser, to return, the same word as to return. Choser b'tshuva, same word, somebody returns in tshuva. He returns, and he returns his verdict. In other words, he uproots his verdict and changes his mind. So that means if it's not that case, says Rav Safra, it must be this case. The ta'ah, he made a mistake, b'shikul hada'at. In the shikul hada'at. So shikul means from mishkal, weight, weighing up, okay, weighing up, da'at. Da'at is an opinion. So he made a mistake. He translates it here, Steinsaltz translates it as where he erred in his deliberation. Shikul hada'at is considering the different opinions. So this was not a situation where there was only one opinion. There's more than one opinion, and he made a mistake in his deliberation over the opinions. Now, how could that be? Because he's a judge. That's the whole point about a judge. A judge weighs up the various different opinions in the case, and he makes a decision. So the Gemarah says it's not a case of a clear and obvious error of the Mishnah, where the opinion is clear in the Mishnah. It's a mistake in Shikul Hadat. He's considered the different opinions, and he's made a mistake in which one that he has chosen. And now the Gemarah is going to explain what we mean by Shikul Hadat, by an error in deliberation. Asks the Gemarah, Heichi dami b'shikul hadat. How can it be? What is it? So give me an example. What are the circumstances of this error in deliberation of the two opinions? Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa gives an example. Kagon, for example, Trei Tanae utrei Amorei depligi ahadadei. Okay, Trei is Aramaic for two. Tanae, you know what Tanaim are? Tanaim are rabbis in the Mishnah. So two Mishnah rabbis, utrei Amorai, or two Amoraim. You know what Amoraim? They are Gemarah rabbis. Depligi ahadadei. They argue one with another. We've already had lots of examples of this. We've had Shmuel and Abahu, who were two Amoraim. We've had Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yehuda. We've had many, many examples of where Tanaim, two rabbis in the Mishnah, disagree, or where two Amoraim, two rabbis in the Gemarah, disagree. Where you have a situation where a Mishnah rabbi argues with a Gemarah rabbi, that's not an equal argument. As we've said before, the Tana trumps the Amorah. So here, Rav Papa is making it clear to us that we're not talking about that situation. We're talking about two equally qualified rabbis arguing against one another. Either two Premier League rabbis, two Tanaim, or two second division rabbis, two Amoraim. But they're both on the same level. And they're arguing one against the other. Velo itmar hilchata, and the halacha has not itmar, from the word lomar, to say. The halacha has not been said, it's not been decided, lo kamar, not like this master, i.e. not like this rabbi, velo kamar, and not like the other rabbi. In other words, this situation is you have two equally important rabbis with differing opinions, and the halacha has never been stated clearly as to which one has precedence. V'sugyan de alma aliba dechad minayhu. But the consensus, he translates it here as the standard practice. V'sugyan de alma, the consensus is aliba dechad minayhu, according to one of them. So in other words, it's not absolutely nailed on 100% that one of them is correct and the other one isn't, but there's a consensus. Maybe 60%, 70% go like Rabbi A, and only 30, 40% go like Rabbi B. So there's a consensus. There may even be a significant majority, but it's not nailed on Mishnah halacha. Va'azil ihu va'avid ki'idach. And our judge here goes and makes the halacha. He gives his decision according to the minority view. So in that situation, he has weighed up the two opinions and he's plumped for the minority. That is called Hainu Shikul Hadat. That is called making a mistake in your deliberation. Now, obviously, we're not talking about a situation where the judge has got a valid reason for going against the consensus. He's not saying, I know that the consensus is according to Rabbi A, and that the halacha according to Rabbi A is X. But I believe that my case here that I'm judging has some special extenuating circumstances. Some different approach needs to be taken for this particular case. And in this particular case, despite the fact that I know that there is a consensus towards Rabbi A, I am going to paskin like Rabbi B. We're not talking about that situation, because in that situation, that's exactly what a judge is meant to do. He's meant to weigh up the scenario. And if he has a valid reason for giving that opinion, you may not like it, but if there is a logical reason, it has to bear logical scrutiny, obviously, why he's gone for Rabbi B, the minority, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where he has made an error in his deliberation. In other words, maybe he got mixed up, and maybe he thought that actually the consensus was Rabbi B and not Rabbi A, when in fact the consensus was Rabbi A. So in that scenario, he cannot retract, because it's not a nailed-on halacha. It's not an absolutely nailed-on halacha. He can't retract his verdict. He's made a mistake, and the litigant who's lost out can come to him and say, you've made a mistake, I've lost out by it, and you have to compensate me for what I've lost out. That is the opinion of the Gemarah, of Rav Papa, as to our very, very, circumscribed situation where this lay judge could be liable for compensation in this scenario. So let's just home in on what the specific circumstances are. First of all, it's a lay judge. It's not an expert judge. Secondly, it's a single judge, or possibly two judges, but our case is a single judge. Thirdly, it's a case where the litigants agreed to abide by this judge's opinion. Fourthly, they agreed to abide by the opinion only if he gave a correct halachic psak. And fifthly, he made a mistake in a situation where there was no 100% nailed on, clear cut halacha, and he can't retract his mistake. So in that very narrow circumstance, a lay judge could be asked to compensate the litigant. Yes, Julia, I knew you were not going to be happy with this, and you were going to ask me a question. I hope I can answer it. You're going to have to unmute.
Okay. I actually have tried to summarize, but I won't go over it now, what I think the situation is with judges. But I don't really understand why this only applies to a lay judge, because we have, as far as I understand it, learnt that in no case can any other than 3 judges make a valid decision. So why would this only apply to a lay judge? What if a professional judge makes this error?
Okay, so as far as the 3 is concerned, you're absolutely right. We started this in November, didn't we? Dinei mamonot b'shlosha. Those are our first words, and we're still involved in that. Here, we're at the moment, we're still in the dispute. Remember that statement of 3 judges needed for a monetary case is still being debated, because remember, we had Shmuel who came
Shmuel
along.
and Rav Nachman. Yes.
Yeah, who came along
Have
and
we
said,
not defeated Shmuel
not
and
yet.
Rav Nachman?
No, we haven't defeated them yet. No,
Ah.
we're still debating them. You'll see as we come into the next bit of Gemarah, we go back to Shmuel and Rav Abahu very shortly. We've not finished with them yet. We're still debating. So that's the first point. The second point is that professional judges were given indemnity against this for the simple reason that nobody would become a professional judge. The lay judge is not going to be very often called upon to be a judge. Maybe once in a Preston guild, as they say up in the north, that you will a person will agree to become a judge. A lay person would agree to become a judge in this situation. A professional judge is doing it all day long, and if he's not got indemnity against damages, then he's very soon going to be skint. So he's never going to be. You're not going to get any judges. Nobody's going to want to be a judge. So the system, as it were, whatever that means, indemnified the judges against claims by litigants for errors that were made.
But if one judge does make a judgment, a professional judge, and yet he's not permitted to because only 3 judges are, then surely the indemnity that he's being given wouldn't operate.
Well, according to the opinion who says you need 3, which we're going to see in a minute, was Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, who says you need 3, any judgment that's made by 1 is invalid in the first place. So there's no indemnity needed. You just say, well, that was a waste of everybody's time. It doesn't count. You might as well all have stayed at home. So that judgment has got no validity whatsoever. The litigant who wins in that court of 1, according to Rabbi Meir, cannot go to the litigant who's lost and claim any money, because the litigant who's lost would say, well, that was a waste of time because it was an invalid court. Okay, so according to Rabbi Meir, there's no compensation ever needed in a court of 1. According to, we're jumping ahead a bit now, but according to Rabbi Shmuel, it was 2, and then there's of course the opinion. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, there's 2, and then there's the opinion that there was 1. So the opinion that 1 counts, your question would be a valid question. But because of what I've said, the indemnity of not having any professional judges because they wouldn't want to be it, that's the scenario.
Got it.
Okay, hang on for the moment, Julia. We'll come back to it when we do the next bit of Gemarah.
Okay.
Yes,
Johnny,
Johnny.
excuse me. If a judge can only rule by, as you said, the halakha, they could have found that out before they went to the judge, couldn't they?
Well, that's the whole point. They go to the judge because the judge is meant to know the halakha, right? That's why you go and ask a shaila of your rabbi. And if you get, right, I'll give you an example, right? I'll give you an example. It's nothing to do with halakha.
To change the opinion sometimes.
Yeah, it depends on the circumstance. But let me give you an example, right? I was this morning looking up in my little Gabai's handbook. I was looking up whether we say Tachanun on the morning of Erev Tisha B'Av. Okay? Now, why wouldn't we? Because Tisha B'Av is, in some respects, called a Mo'ed. It's called a Mo'ed. It's called a Yom Tov. And we don't say Tachanun at Mincha before Tisha B'Av. We don't say Tachanun at Mincha anyway in our shul, but that's just some crazy minhag that we have. But nobody says Tachanun Erev Tisha B'Av at Mincha. We also don't say Tachanun or Shacharit Erev Chag. So I wanted to know, I wasn't sure whether Tisha B'Av, which is called a Moed, it's called a Yom Tov, because in the future, please God, even as late as this year, when Tisha B'Av is no longer a sad day and the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, etc. We'll talk about this on Thursday in some detail. Tisha B'Av is going to be called a festival. So I wanted to know whether we said Tachanun this morning or not. In case you're interested, we do say Tachanun, and we did say Tachanun. But whilst I was looking in this little Gabai's handbook, something caught my eye, which was a bit odd in my mind. And it said in there that when you lane the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, this coming Shabbat, which is in Parshat Va'et Chanan, you lane it with the Ta'am HaTachton. David Marks will know this very well, and anybody else who has been a Baal Korah will know that there are two lots of notes for the 10 Commandments. There's one called the Ta'am HaElyon, the higher notes, and one called the Ta'am HaTachton, the lower notes. Now, normally, when you are reading the Chumash, if you're learning the Chumash on your own without being in a minyan, you use the lower notes. And when you're learning it in public, you use the Ta'am HaElyon, the higher notes. So this caught my eye because it said that we use the lower notes when we lane Va'et Chanan. Now, I'd never heard of such a thing. And that sounded like, to me, that wasn't right. I've never heard of such a thing. And I've laned the Aseret HaDibrot, I don't know, I wouldn't like to say hundreds of times, but certainly tens of times over the years. And I've never, ever used the Ta'am HaTachton, the lower notes, when laning it in public. So this was strange to me. It's written out there in the Gabai's handbook. And I thought that this was a mistake. So I called up a man who knows about these things, and he agreed with me that this was not correct, and it was a mistake. Let me just ask a man who also knows. David, what have you got to say about that?
No, it's not a mistake. It's different minhagim according to the place. I think minhag Yerushalayim, when it comes to Yitron Shavuot, laying in Tam Elyon, but for Va'et Chanan, because it's considered lower, lower significance, because it's in Mishneh Torah, they lane to Tam Tachton. So it's not a mistake. However, I'm with you on this, Johnny, that whenever I've laned on each of the three occasions, my minhag is always the Tam Elyon. But as I said, it is minhag hamakom, it's not a mistake.
Okay, so that is exactly the answer that was given to me by the person that I asked, who is a man who knows about these things. And it seems that it is very much a minhag Eretz Yisrael, and of course the Gabai's little handbook that I've got is minhag Eretz Yisrael, but it seems that it's not a minhag all the way across Eretz Yisrael. It seems to be I don't think it's just Yerushalayim, but I assume it would be in congregations who have based themselves on minhag Yerushalayim. So here we have a situation. I know we're not talking about monetary cases here, but here would be a good example of shikul hadat. This is not a mistake as I thought it was a mistake. This is a situation where the majority of people would say you use the higher ta'amim, the higher notes, and a minority would say you use a lower notes. Now, if I was to have asked somebody and they would have said, well, where you are in Ramat Poleg, you should use the lower notes, that would be an example here of an error of shikul hadat, because the majority would go and say you should use Tam HaElyon, which is what we are going to use on Shabbat because I'm laning it, and therefore it's going to be in Tam HaElyon. But it was a good example because I thought it was an error. I thought it was a printing mistake, but it's not a printing mistake. What they were saying was minhag Yerushalayim, or at least part of Yerushalayim, and the mistake, if there was a mistake, was in not explaining that there are two different minhagim around. So that's just an example which occurred this very morning, which is an example of shikul hadat. Okay.
Going back, Johnny,
I don't actually remember your question now, Johnny. What was it?
I was saying if they rule, it's got to rule by the halakha, pesach halakha, They don't need a judge. Just look it up.
Okay. So yeah. So the answer is, if you don't know, if you look at something, you think you know the halacha, but if you remember, we had a Gemarah a few weeks ago that said, unless you have permission to give a psak, you can't give a psak. Unless you've got a smicha, and that includes for yourself, right?
Yeah.
Unless it's absolutely obvious, you can't make psak for yourself. So usually you'll find that even rabbis go to rabbis for a psak because they shouldn't be making psak for themselves. Why? Because they have vested interests.
Okay.
Sorry, Johnny.
Just going back to the Tachnun, you said it's a crazy thing here. In Vine Street, we didn't say Tachnun by minute because it's not that bad as we haven't here.
Yeah, but you will have
It's not so crazy.
No, you will have said Tachanun in Vine Street when you should have said Tachanun. The only time you don't say Tachanun in Vine Street is when there's either some kind of yortzeit going on, or it's too late to say Tachanun. You can't say Tachanun if you daven mincha.
No, for mincha I'm talking about mincha.
Yeah, I'm talking about mincha.
Never said it for mincha.
I don't think that's right. I think if you go to Tachanun in Vine Street early enough, in other words, before after Plag, then they will say Tachanun. They only don't say Tachanun because it's too late to say Tachanun. We don't say Tachanun here, whatever time we daven mincha, which is crazy. Yeah. Send a message to your brother and ask him if they say Tachanun in Vine Street when they daven an early mincha. I'm not talking about Erev Tisha B'Av, I'm talking about on a regular day.
Yeah, I will,
Okay, yes, David.
Yeah, there is one Erev Yom Tov that you do say Tachanun, Johnny.
Which is Erev Yom Kippur.
No?
Erev Rosh Hashanah? Yeah, Erev Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, it's not a chag. Rosh Hashanah is not a chag. It's a moed, but it's not a chag.
Agreed, but Tish B'Av is also a moed.
Nachon, which is why you say Tachanun in the morning.
Yeah, because there are different reasons why you don't say Tachanun on Erev Chag, because there are already periods where there's no Tachanun.
It's a complicated business, and it's much easier if you take Minhag Poleg and don't say it ever. So
I like that.
Or if you take
Thursday.
Minhag Chasidim, that whenever anybody who's got there's a yortzeit of anybody important, and whether you're important enough is entirely subjective. Whenever there's a Tachanun, whenever there's a yortzeit of any kind of rebbe or anybody that's ever done a mitzvah ever, then you can get away without saying Tachanun. In Machziki Adas in Manchester, which is a Hasidic place, I would say probably 5 days out of 6 they never said Tachanun because they'll always find some Rebbe's yortzeit to invoke not to say Tachanun. Okay, we've digressed, but there we go. We're allowed to digress because we're learning a Gemarah, and that's what the Gemarah does all the time. So there we have a shikul hadat. Okay, so that's the idea of deliberation. Now we're going to go back to our gufa now, to our body of our Gemarah. There we are with our little symbol, our little S symbol there. The Gemarah is now going to go back to our discussion of how many judges it requires to adjudicate a case. As we just said before, when I was answering Julia's question, we're still debating the first 3 words of the Mishnah. Dinei mamonot bishlosha. 3 judges are required for a monetary case. We've still not bottomed this out. So we are going to now have another go. Lema, let us say, ketanae. Let us say that this argument between Shmuel, who says that a bet din of 2 has a valid judgment, notwithstanding the fact that they are called a chutzpahdik bet din, it's still valid, versus Rabbi Bahu, who says no, everybody agrees that a bet din needs to be 3. This dispute between them, let's say, remember, Shmuel and Rabbi Abahu are both Amoraim. Granted, Shmuel is one of the very early Amoraim, and Rabbi Abahu is a later Amorah, but nevertheless, they're still in the same division and they're allowed to have a machloket. They are both Amoraim. What the Gemarah is now saying is, hang on a minute, maybe this dispute between Shmuel and Rabbi Abahu is the same dispute as there is between 2 Tanaim, 2 earlier and therefore more important Rabbanim from the Mishnah, the Tanaim. Now, why would the Gemarah want to bring us an earlier dispute? Okay, now the answer to that is very simple. If it's a dispute between Tanaim, then it must be that these 2 Amoraim, Shmuel and Rabbi Abahu, would have known that, because they knew the Mishnah, and they certainly would have known all the Brisas. They would have known if there was a dispute between 2 Tanaim. And if there was a dispute between 2 Tanaim, then what have they got to add? That's a bit like the chief rabbi giving a psak, and I come along and put my 2 pennies worth in. What have I got to add if the chief rabbi's already given a psak? I don't have anything to add. The Amoraim would have nothing to add to a Tanaic dispute. So that means the fact that there's a Tanaic dispute and an Amoraim dispute means that there must be some other point that the Amoraim are bringing to bear, which will have an influence on the outcome. They're not just parroting the Tanaic disputes, because that's pointless. There's no point me saying, well, I agree with the chief rabbi. What difference does it make whether I agree with the chief rabbi? The chief rabbi said it. His opinion stands on its own. It doesn't need me to agree with him. So why would the Amoraim come along and have a dispute where there's already been a Tanaic dispute? So the Gemarah says, let's say, when it says lema, let us say, it's not saying it is definitely a Tanaic dispute. In that situation, it would say Tanai. It is a Tanaic dispute. It's putting a hypothesis here. Lema, let us say it's a proposal. Let's say that this is a Tanaic dispute, and it quotes a brisa. It quotes the following brisa: Bitzua bishlosha. Mediation or compromise. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Sorry, bishlosha. Compromise requires 3 judges. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that that's the case. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says a compromise, you need 3 judges. V'chachamim omrim, and the rabbis say, pshara b'yachid. A compromise can be adjudicated or can be negotiated by a yachid, an individual, by one judge. Now, there's one thing that must strike you about that Breita. Come on. Yes, Julia, unmute and tell me what's weird about that Breita.
No, I'm probably not going to tell you the answer that you want, but it seems to me that they actually are not contradictory in that it's only permissive. Can be isn't mandatory. So that if it said mediation must be performed and the rabbi said compromise must be performed, then there would be a contradiction. But with them using the words can, which is just permissive, then I don't think it's contradictory. But
okay, let me deal with that point. And what you have done is you have read into Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation too much, or my translation, because the Hebrew words, or actually the I suppose the Aramaic words to be strictly true, doesn't say can or must. It says bitzua bishlosha. Compromise is with 3. Pshara biyachid. Compromise is with 1. It doesn't say can or must. It just says it is. Now, he's translated it as can be, and you've interpreted can be as permissive, whereas he could have said must be, because it doesn't say either. The implication of the Breita is it must be. So I think that's not right what you said. I can understand why you said it because of the translation here and of how I translated it. In imprecise use of English words, really it should be translated as bitzua bishlosha. A compromise or mediation is with 3 judges. Divrei Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim, the Chachamim say pshara b'yachid. Compromise is with a single judge. So you're right to point that out, but it's not right. Okay, Howard, what have you noticed?
Well, I noticed the word even, and the later very often qualifies the former, the earlier rather. Okay,
well you've done the same as Julia, because you have interpreted a word which in the Steinsaltz, where my thingy-majig is over here, my pointer is not in bold type. If it's not in bold type, it's words that he's added in to help us understand the meaning, but it's not a translation. The translation is the literal translation is just the bold words. So he's put compromise by a single.
Okay, I'll drop the even for the reason you gave and suggest that very often the later qualifies the earlier. A later statement qualifies an earlier statement.
That's often true, but there's a glaring thing here in this Breita, which I want somebody to point out to me.
It says mediation.
Okay, go on, Michael.
Well, it's not a case. It's arbitration as opposed to a halakha or a halakhic case.
Okay, all right, that's true. I thought you were onto it there for a sec. All right, anybody else? David.
Yeah, one says bitzua and the other one says peshara.
Yes.
What's the difference between the two?
Look at the actual words, and in fact, Rabbi Steinsaltz even translates them differently. Bitzua bishlosha. Rabbi Meir says bitzua bishlosha, which Steinsaltz translates as mediation, is adjudicated by a panel of 3. The Chachamim say pshara, compromise. They are 2 different words. So even Steinsaltz, or not even Steinsaltz, Rabbi Steinsaltz clearly has used those words advisedly because they're not the same words. So if they're not the same words, then clearly we're not talking, or we might not clearly, perhaps we're not talking about the same thing. We've got a Breita here where Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim appear to be in dispute. But are they in dispute? Because they appear to be talking about completely different words. One is talking about bitzua, and the other is talking about pshara. So before we can actually understand this Breita, and before we can actually understand whether this really is a similar dispute to the one that Shmuel and Rabbi Abahu are discussing, we need to know what Rabbi Meir means by bitzua and what the Chachamim mean by pshara. Perhaps they are the same thing, but if they are the same thing, then I want to know why they've used different words for it.
Is it not that a single judge can't mediate and 3 people can't compromise?
Okay, so what you're saying, Johnny, is that these are two different processes going on.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Hold that for a second. Johnny's opinion, I'll come to you in a second, Howard. Leon first. Johnny's opinion is that the Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim are talking about two different processes. One is a process of mediation and one is a process of compromise, which is the way Rav Steinsaltz has translated them. Leon, what's your view?
It's interesting that the art scroll translates Bitsua and Vashara as compromise, both.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I noticed that as well, because when I prepare this shiur, I use both the Steinsaltz and the art scroll. So yes, okay, that's a good observation. So clearly, we seem to have a machloket between Rav Steinsaltz and the Holy Art Scroll as to whether Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim are talking about the same thing. The Art Scroll would appear to say that Bitsua and Pshara are just two words describing the same process, and Rav Steinsaltz seems to be saying that they are two different processes with two different names. Howard and then Julia.
Well, I assume compromise judgment is where the parties agree how they want to resolve the matter, and they go to the judge and say, we've agreed to compromise, so will you sign this off? It doesn't need three of you, it just needs one because we're agreed.
Okay, that's a very strong point. Whereas mediation, Howard, as opposed to that, mediation would be?
Let's say a day in which, I'll tell you how it operates today. There's a mediator, if you like, three, and the two parties and their legal representatives, and they meet and then they go off into breakout sessions and they negotiate, and the mediator tries to bring them together. I can imagine that in some systems you might need three mediators rather than one. Actually,
so your description there would fit in with Rav Steinsaltz's translation of these two words, because you're describing two completely different, although similar, processes. Fine. Julia, what have you got to say?
I would have thought that mediation and compromise are not the same processes. Mediation is the legal process by which somebody helps litigants to make a decision. Compromise is what the litigants do. The judge doesn't compromise, the litigants compromise. So you're not comparing like with like at all.
Okay, so you're saying pretty much, I think, the same as Howard, that they're two different processes, and therefore both Julia and Howard, and I think Rav Steinsaltz, would question the whole basis of this part of the Gemarah by bringing a braita which doesn't seem to support that there is a machloket, because we're talking about two different processes. And it could well be that the Chachamim would agree with Rabbi Meir that Bitsua needs three, and Rabbi Meir may agree with the Chachamim that Pshara only requires one. We're talking about two totally different situations. Now, that is also how I understood it, and I was ready to dismiss this braita, and I thought that's what the Gemarah was going to say to us, but it seems that it doesn't. And what's interesting is that the art scroll, which translates both words as compromise, seems to be the approach that the Gemarah itself is taking. The Gemarah itself seems to take the approach that we're talking about the same process, only Rabbi Meir has a different name for it to the Chachamim. And the reason that Rabbi Meir has a different name for it is very interesting. And I'm going to explain that to you now. In order to understand why Rabbi Meir has a different name, we have to understand what this word bitsua and what the word pshara mean. Let's deal with the easy one first. Pshara. Yes, Johnny.
I'm sorry to interrupt. On the notes on the left-hand side of where it says mediation compromise, it tells you about the two words. I don't say I understand it, but I don't know. Have you looked at that? The same argument we're discussing, aren't they?
Lost you there, Johnny. You broke up.
Sorry, on the left-hand side it says notes,
Yeah.
mediation compromise. On the
Yeah.
second paragraph it says it appears a difference between the two terms, what it reflects. I don't understand it because I'm not legally minded. But
Okay, we'll come to that in a minute. We'll come to that in a minute.
okay.
We'll come to that note in a minute. I'm just going to take it down so you can't read it while I explain it. And then
I've got one in front of me.
I know you have, but everybody else has.
Okay, sorry.
So we'll come to that note after I've explained the two terms.
Okay.
Now, pshara, which is the word that the Chachamim use, we explained this last week. Remember I said to you that if you go to your mikveh and you see 3 different mikvaot, as there are in many places, you may see one that says Mayim Chamim, hot water. That's going to be jolly hot if you go in there. Mayim Karim, that's going to be a plunge pool. That's going to be cold. And the one that you might want to go into is the one which will have a sign saying Mayim Poshrim, Pei Vav Shin Resh Yud Mem. Poshrim, same word as pshara, and that means lukewarm. And that lukewarm, of course, is a compromise between hot and cold. So the word pshara literally means a compromise. It's neither one thing nor another. It's neither cold nor hot. It's lukewarm, or as they say in the vernacular, nishtahin and nishtaher. Neither one thing nor another. That's pshara. Now, bitsua, which is the word that Rabbi Meir uses, is a word which we find in the Tanakh. We find it in the book of Proverbs. In the book of Proverbs, in Mishlei, let me find it for you. Mishlei, where's Mishlei? There we go. Here's Mishlei. Where's Mishlei gone? There it is. Chapter 1. Okay. Verse 19. Here we go. Can you see the screen? You should have Mishlei on the screen now. Okay. This is talking. Mishlei is Proverbs. It was written by King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. And it's giving, and this particular part of Mishlei, it's giving you some advice about avoiding bad company, avoiding people who do bad things. It's telling you stay away from them. Why? Because Cain arachot kol botsea, batsa et nefesh ba'alav yikach. So are the ways of those people who commit robbery. Botsea means to rob. Batsa et nefesh ba'alav yikach. It will rob you or take away the owner of its nefesh, of its soul. So what Shlomo HaMelech is telling you in this pasuk is stay away from bad people, because bad people who do bad things will rob you of your soul. They'll draw you in, they'll suck you in, and you'll become like them, and you will lose your soul. They'll rob you of your nefesh. And he uses the word botsea. Now, if we think about this with our Mishnah, let's go back to our Gemarah. There we are. We think of our Brisa. Rabbi Meir says bitsua bishlosha. Rabbi Meir is talking about a compromise, but he uses this very negative term, which implies robbery. And the reason he uses that is because his opinion is that bitsua, compromise, is wrong. We should not be doing compromise. Rabbi Meir is a very strict halachist. Halachist? Yeah. He is somebody who wants the truth. He's an ish emet. He's not interested in compromise because he thinks that either way, compromise involves robbery. Because in a case, according to Rabbi Meir, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And somebody is entitled to the money and somebody is not. And if you do a compromise, by definition, somebody has, inverted commas, robbed somebody else. So let's say Reuven owes Shimon 100 shekels, and they make a compromise that Reuven will give him 50 shekels, or Shimon will give him 50 shekels back. Well, that's not psak halacha. That can't be right, because there's nobody that says he owes 50 shekels. Shimon says he owes nothing, and Reuven says he owes 100. So Reuven's not happy because he's only got 50, and Shimon's not happy because he's had to give 50 when he doesn't think he should give anything. So according to Rabbi Meir, compromise is robbery at least once and probably twice, because Shimon thinks he's been robbed of 50 and Reuven thinks he's been robbed of 50. So Rabbi Meir does not like compromise at all, and he expresses his disdain, if you like, for compromise by calling it bitsua rather than using the correct term, which is pshara. In other words, the word bitsua is Rabbi Meir's way of being pejorative about the whole process of compromise. And I wanted to point that out to you in some detail because I think it's brilliant. That first of all, it's brilliant that Rabbi Meir is such an ish emet. I think I've probably told you this once before. I only ever went to a din Torah once, and I never got that far because I was persuaded to go to mediation. I'm a Rabbi Meir. I'm an ish emet. And I did not like this whole process of mediation because I knew I was right, and and as it so happens, the whole case was wrong, and it didn't involve anything in the end. It all fell apart. But had there been a compromise, I would have felt hard done by because I didn't think that there was any position for a compromise, and I wasn't actually aware of what process that was going on. But had I been asked, as the litigants should be asked, do you, and we think we had this earlier on in the Gemarah, do you want a psak or do you want a compromise? Had I been asked that, I would have been a Rabbi Meir and I'd have said, I want a psak. Partly because I was very confident of my position, and partly because innately, I'm a very black and white person. It doesn't do for me, this wishy-washy. So I can certainly relate to Rabbi Meir's use of the word bitsua to describe a compromise. Okay, so we've actually run out of time. I'd hoped that we'd have got a bit more done today, but nevertheless, I think it's a reasonable place to stop because we've understood that we are talking about a single process here, and the fact that it is two different terms is only because Rabbi Meir is not happy with the whole process. It's not because it's two different processes. We can now go up the page and look at those notes that Johnny was referring to on the left-hand side of the screen here. Rav Steinsaltz writes, it's clear from the context of the discussion, which is what we said before, that these two terms refer to the same process. Rabbi Meir, who holds that this process must be performed by three judges, it describes it with the term mediation bitsua. The rabbis who hold it may be performed by a single judge just use the term compromise pshara. It appears that the difference between the two terms reflects the different conceptions of the nature of this process. According to one, that's Rabbi Meir, bitsua is related to betza, greed or advantage, and according to this opinion, mediation is undesirable. This is Rabbi Meir, he doesn't desire it, as it may result in one of the parties forfeiting money to which he's actually entitled, whereas a genuine court hearing would determine the proper and just resolution. Another opinion about this word bitsua means it's cutting. Now we know that from in Shulchan Aruch. We talk about if you go into the halachot of how you make hamotzi, it talks about to cut the bread. It uses this expression of bitsua. It means to cut, and here it means to cut it in half, as it were. Half. That's what happens in a compromise. Half goes to one, and half goes to the other. So that note there really explains what we've already said, that Rabbi Meir sees the idea of pshara in a negative way. Okay, so let's stop there. And next week, we will go and see a bit more deeply whether this really is a machloket between Tanaim, i.e. between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, or whether they're actually arguing about something slightly different. So that's what we'll do, please God, next week. But for the moment, we'll leave it with Rabbi Meir being the one who says, just by his expression, the one who's not keen on compromise. And perhaps because he's not keen on compromise, perhaps that's why he is the one that says it's 3 judges required, because he's trying to push it to be as near to a judicial process as possible, whereas the Chachamim, who seem to, in some ways, prefer the idea of compromise to avoid machloket, they will happily do it with 1. And I suppose there's always been an expression that struck me as being perhaps useful in this expression. You may find that there are people that try to be all things to all people, and they try to please everybody. Now, if you try to please everybody and you succeed, then you are the Chachamim, you've got pshara, you've pleased everybody. But quite often when you try to please everybody and you try to be all things to all people, you end up being nothing to nobody, and you end up displeasing everybody, and nobody is satisfied. And that, I think, is Rabbi Meir's view. So Rabbi Meir is the one that says, don't try to be all things to all people. Try and come to a decision, a correct decision. And the Chachamim will try and say, try and at least get a decision which at least both parties can live with, even if they're not going to be entirely happy with it. So that's where we're holding at the moment. We'll stop there. And we will continue, please God, next Wednesday. Before I stop recording, are there any questions or comments regarding this Gemarah? Yes, Howard. Unmute.
What I'd like to know is this: was all this written down? Was English law is based on precedent, and you know where to find an earlier decision to get that precedent. To what extent were these findings and rulings written down, or was it all passed on orally?
Okay, well, the answer to that question really lies in the structure of the Talmud. The Talmud consists of the Mishnah and the Gemarah, as you know. The Mishnah was written down by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in around about 200. Up until the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, everything was passed down orally. Around about 200, which was about 130 years after the destruction of the temple, and more importantly than the destruction of the temple, the galut, the dispersion, the exile, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was scared that all this oral tradition would get lost because there was such a dispersion. So he wrote it all down. He wrote it all down in a particular format, which in some places was absolutely clear, which we've spoken about this morning, Dvar Mishnah, 100% nailed on. And he wrote other things down, and other things didn't even get into the Mishnah, which were not so clear-cut. The Gemarah, 300 years later, is an exercise largely in understanding what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi meant when he wrote it down. So the Gemarah is largely going back to precedent, whereas the Mishnah is setting the precedent based on oral tradition.
Terrific answer, thank you.
Any other questions?
Oh,
on
sorry.
our Gemarah.
Great answer. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, if there's no other questions, I'll stop recording and we'll carry on next week. Have a good week.